In a world that measures brilliance by the weight of diplomas and the color of skin, one woman dares to stand in the quiet power of her own truth. Aaliyah Mitchell, once a prodigy of aerospace engineering, now a quiet librarian in the heart of Detroit, carries secrets that could shatter the polished illusions of the industry that betrayed her. When she is called upon to fix an impossible engine, one built from the very designs stolen from her, Aaliyah must decide whether to let the past define her or to rise once more, not in anger, but in quiet, unshakable conviction. This is not just a story of engines and equations. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the unbreakable bond between a woman and her dreams, and the quiet revolution that begins when we refuse to let the world tell us who we are. Are you ready to witness the silent triumph of a heart that refuses to be silenced? Let's begin. Aaliyah Mitchell stood at the edge of the stage beneath the relentless glow of the spotlights in Sterling Aerospace's cavernous auditorium, her simple white blouse and well-worn jeans, a jarring contrast to the sea of tailored suits and pressed lab coats that surrounded her, the subtle murmur of 100 skeptical voices blending with the quiet hum of fluorescent lights overhead. And as Richard Sterling, the CEO himself, raised the microphone to his lips, his words cut through the air like a blade, thick with feigned courtesy and the thinly veiled condescension of a man who had already decided the outcome of this performance. "Ladies and gentlemen," he intoned, his eyes flicking dismissively over Aaliyah's form, "we gather here today to witness whether an unaccredited mechanic can match wits with the best minds of our industry." And the crowd responded in kind, polite laughter, echoing off the polished walls. But Aaliyah stood silent, her dark eyes steady, her breath even, the slight tremor in her fingers belied by the quiet steel in her posture. And in that moment, she seemed both impossibly small and immeasurably vast, a figure carved from quiet defiance as she regarded the RZ-7000 engine looming in the center of the stage, a marvel of aerospace engineering worth $2 million. Yet silenced by a flaw that had eluded the company's finest for days. And as Sterling's words washed over her, his theatrical challenge, his open invitation for her to fail, Aaliyah remembered the taste of burned coffee in her chipped mug that morning, the brittle chill of dawn pressing against the thin glass of her window in Detroit's East Side, the muted clang of industry in the distance reminding her that she had once believed in a world where brilliance was measured not by the whiteness of a man's collar or the weight of his degree, but by the spark of understanding that glowed in the eyes of a child who had glimpsed the promise of the stars. And so, when Sterling, with a flourish of his hand, declared, "30 minutes, Ms. Mitchell. Show us what you're made of," she bent to retrieve the wrench he tossed so carelessly at her feet, feeling the chill of the metal against her palm as she straightened to meet the unspoken question in the faces of the audience, her lips parting around a slow, measured breath, her mind already mapping the pathways of combustion, resonance, and pressure, because beneath the laughter and the weight of 100 dismissive eyes lay the echo of a promise she had made to herself as a girl, watching the plumes of rocket fuel rise from Cape Canaveral and vowing that one day she would be the one who built the engines that carried humanity to the stars. And if that promise was a quiet thing, if it was a private thing, it was no less unbreakable for being so. And so she moved, her hands steady as she traced the engine's casing, her gaze flicking from rivet to seam, cataloging every detail, the crowd's laughter fading to a low, expectant murmur as the seconds slipped by, and she worked in a silence that was anything but empty. For Aaliyah knew that in this moment, she was not just proving herself to the men in their pressed shirts and designer ties. She was proving herself to the girl she used to be, the girl who had believed in the power of curiosity and the quiet strength of a mind that refused to bend, and with each turn of the wrench, each precise adjustment of the calibration tools she requested, with a calmness that belied the maelstrom of memory and betrayal swirling in her chest, she felt the years fall away, the whispered doubts of others falling silent in the presence of the steady, measured rhythm of her breath, the steady, measured movement of her fingers. And when she finally stepped back, the wrench held lightly in her hand like a conductor's baton at the end of a symphony. The hush that fell over the room was the hush of a world forced to see what it had long refused to acknowledge, that brilliance does not ask permission, that truth does not bow to pedigree, and that sometimes it takes the quietest voice in the room to reveal the flaw in the heart of an empire built on arrogance and exclusion. Aaliyah's breath caught for a brief moment as the engine's cold metal seemed to pulse beneath her fingertips. A memory of countless nights spent hunched over blueprints in dimly lit workshops whispering through her thoughts, and for a heartbeat, she was no longer standing in this auditorium under the glare of judgmental eyes, but in the cramped lab she had once called home. The soft glow of her computer monitor reflecting equations in her dark irises as she chased the perfection of propulsion curves and thermal dynamics, driven not by the need for recognition or the weight of others' expectations, but by an almost sacred reverence for the delicate balance of forces that could lift humanity past the bonds of gravity. And as she turned her focus back to the present, she could feel the quiet storm of her past building in her chest. Each memory a blade honed by betrayal and disbelief, but she let it flow through her, let it ground her instead of consume her, because she understood that the only power that truly mattered here was the power she claimed for herself, in the face of everything they told her she couldn't be. And so, when the young engineer with the fresh MIT diploma and the too bright smile leaned forward to mutter a dismissive remark, she did not flinch, her hands moving with a precision that was both deliberate and defiant as she twisted the calibration valve, her fingers brushing against the faint ridges of old scars that marked her right wrist. A silent testament to the night when her future had been stolen by a man who saw her genius only as a means to his own ends. And the crowd watched, their laughter dying in their throats as they began to sense the gravity of what was unfolding before them. The hush that settled over the room, not just a pause in the noise, but a crack in the wall of arrogance that had been built up around this place. And in that hush, Aaliyah found her rhythm, her thoughts aligning like the gears of the engine. She was now coaxing back to life, each movement deliberate, each adjustment a note in a melody only she could hear. And when Richard Sterling's voice cut through the silence once more, 10 minutes left, Ms. Mitchell. She did not falter, her gaze flicking to the diagnostic display and reading the numbers with the kind of certainty that can't be taught in any classroom, her mind already 2 steps ahead, tracing the flow of pressure, the harmonics of the combustion chamber, the delicate dance of fuel and fire that would either redeem her or consume her. And as she worked, her thoughts drifted briefly to the children at the library, the wide-eyed wonder they carried in their questions, the way their hands reached for the stars, even as the world told them those stars were not meant for them. And she realized then that this moment was not just about her. It was about every child who had ever been told that their dreams were too big, every girl whose hands had been pushed away from the tools she longed to hold, every quiet soul who had been told to stay small and silent in the face of those who would claim the sky for themselves. And with that thought, she tightened the last bolt, her hands steady as she whispered to herself, not a prayer, but a promise, before stepping back and meeting Sterling's gaze head-on, the quiet blaze in her dark eyes saying more than any words ever could. As the last echoes of the engine's measured purr reverberated through the vast chamber, Aaliyah's eyes never wavered from the console that now displayed a sea of green, each digit, each perfect parameter, a testament to the precision of her craft and the unassailable truth of her knowledge. And in that charged silence, the collective breath of the room held still, as if even the walls of Sterling Aerospace had been compelled to acknowledge the power of the moment. And slowly, almost reluctantly, Richard Sterling took a step forward, the self-assurance that had laced his every word now gone, replaced by a wary curiosity he could not quite contain, his lips parting around words that tasted foreign on his tongue. "How did you know?" But Aaliyah did not answer, not immediately, for she had learned that the truth did not owe itself to the demands of those who once dismissed it, and instead she let her silence hang between them, a silent rebuke and a quiet claim of space that had long been denied her, her thoughts returning briefly to that night in Houston, when she had watched the trajectory of her life shatter like glass under the weight of betrayal, the smell of burning metal and the acrid taste of betrayal on her tongue as she realized that even brilliance could be stolen if the thief was patient and calculating enough. And for a moment, her fingers curled around the edge of the console, the ghost of that night pressing cold against her skin. But she did not let it show. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her pain. And so, when she finally spoke, her voice was calm and steady, each word a deliberate choice. "I recognize the flaw because I designed the original system this engine is based on," she said, her tone neither boastful nor apologetic, simply factual. And in the stunned quiet that followed, She felt the shift in the room, like the tilt of the earth beneath her feet, the quickening of breath, the sudden bright eyes of the young engineers who had once laughed at her and now saw her for what she was, more than the color of her skin, more than the simplicity of her clothes, more than the scars she carried from a night no one but her would ever truly understand. And when one of the younger engineers, his voice tinged with wonder and disbelief, stammered, "But they said the woman who designed that system was gone, dead even." Aaliyah let the faintest ghost of a smile touch her lips, a smile that held both sadness and triumph, and she lifted her chin, meeting the gazes of those who had doubted her, those who had tried to erase her, and those who had come simply to watch her fail, and with a quiet certainty she said, "I'm still here." And in that moment, her presence filled the space like a force of nature, not loud, not brash, but undeniable in its quiet gravity. And she knew that whatever came next, whether they chose to recognize her or not, she had already reclaimed something far more valuable than reputation or title. She had reclaimed her own voice, and in doing so, she had reminded every soul in that room that truth, once spoken, has a power that cannot be denied. Richard Sterling's face was a mask of disbelief, and something else, an unspoken reckoning that flickered behind his pale eyes as he looked at Aaliyah, at the woman he had tried to frame as an imposter, but who now stood with an unassailable calm, her posture straight and unwavering, her brown skin aglow under the sterile lights, as if it was a quiet defiance in itself. And though his mouth opened as if to challenge her, to reclaim the fragile authority he had wielded so confidently only moments before, the words caught in his throat, because the engine's perfect hum was a chorus of truth he could not deny. And around them, the audience shifted. The journalists who had once poised their pens to document her failure, now scribbling feverishly to capture this unexpected revelation. The young engineers leaning forward in their seats with eyes wide as the pieces of her story began to settle into place. And in that charged silence, Aaliyah could feel the weight of every dismissal, every whispered slight that had followed her since she was a little girl with dirt-streaked knees and a head full of constellations. And she drew strength from it, the way a tree grows stronger around the wound of a broken branch. And when she spoke again, her voice was as even and patient as the steady rhythm of her heart. "The RS-7000 is a flawed reflection of the work I did for Orion," she said, her words falling into the room like small, measured stones that rippled outward, copied without understanding the fundamental principles that hold it together. And as the words took root in the stunned hush, she reached into her pocket and drew out the small, worn NASA pin she had carried every day since she walked away from that life, her thumb brushing the familiar groove of the engraved motto, "Ad astra per aspera," to the stars through adversity. And she held it up for them all to see, not as a plea for validation, but as a simple statement of fact. A reminder that her hands had once shaped the future of flight, and that no amount of deceit could erase that legacy. And as she spoke of pressure ratios and resonance frequencies, of bypass ratios and fuel injection timing, the language of aerospace engineering flowed from her lips, with the easy cadence of a poet reciting verses that had lived in her bones long before this moment. And it was not just knowledge she shared, it was ownership, an unspoken but unmistakable claim to the very soul of the machine they had tried to make their own. And for a heartbeat, the room was utterly silent, the air crackling with the realization that the woman they had sought to diminish was, in truth, the architect of the very power they sought to harness. And when she finally fell silent, letting the last of her words settle into the stillness, the quiet was no longer the hush of anticipation, but the breathless reverence of a congregation in the presence of something sacred and undeniable. And Aaliyah knew, in that fragile, potent pause, that she had just rewritten the narrative they had tried to force upon her, not with anger or grand speeches, but with the quiet, steadfast certainty of someone who had always known that her worth was not theirs to give or take. For a long, suspended moment, the air in the vast hall seemed to hum with the vibration of possibility, as if the walls themselves were listening to the truth Aaliyah had laid bare. And in that silence, the weight of every carefully constructed lie, every dismissal and condescending laugh, seemed to collapse inward like a dying star. And Aaliyah stood in the quiet center of it all, feeling the pulse of her own heartbeat steady and sure, her breath calm as she met the eyes of each person who had come to see her falter. And she saw in those faces a shifting tapestry of shame and awe, of sudden understanding that brilliance was not a matter of pedigree or privilege, but of passion and persistence. And as she let her gaze drift across the room, she caught the flicker of something almost like hope in the eyes of a young black girl seated in the back row, her braids pulled tight and her eyes wide. And for an instant, Aaliyah remembered herself at that age, how the world had told her in so many ways to stay small, to be quiet, to not reach beyond the boundaries drawn by those who feared her light. And she felt a quiet surge of pride that she had never stopped reaching, never stopped believing that her mind was as capable and worthy as any man's, as any white man's. And in that knowing, she found the calm to turn her attention back to Richard Sterling, who now looked as if the floor had been swept from beneath his feet, his hands clutching the podium for balance as the reality of what had just unfolded settled into the fine lines of his carefully curated mask. And when he spoke again, his voice was soft and brittle, the bravado that had carried him thus far reduced to a hollow shell. "Why didn't you tell us who you really were?" he asked, the question trembling in the quiet. But Aaliyah only tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. And when she answered, her voice carried the weight of years lived in the shadows of other people's ambitions. "Because you didn't ask," she said simply. And the simplicity of her words was like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples of understanding out through the room, and she let the truth of it hang there, because she had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is to refuse to justify their existence to those who never saw them clearly to begin with. And in that moment, she did not offer apologies or explanations. She did not beg for acceptance or understanding. She simply stood in the fullness of who she was. Aaliyah Mitchell, the woman who had once designed engines to carry men beyond the sky, the woman who had lost everything to betrayal, but who had never lost the quiet fire that drove her to build and rebuild and reach for something greater, no matter how many times the world tried to clip her wings. And as the seconds stretched out, she saw in the way Sterling's shoulders sagged, in the way the young engineer who had mocked her earlier now stared at the floor, that she had done something more profound than fixing a machine. She had forced them all to confront the limits of their own vision, to see that genius does not ask permission to exist, that it does not wear the trappings of wealth or whiteness to be real. And in that realization, she felt a quiet, unshakable victory that no applause could ever match. In the stillness that followed, the faint whir of the engine's diagnostics seemed to echo like a heartbeat, a steady affirmation of Aaliyah's unassailable skill. And as she stood there, the weight of the moment pressed against her skin like the humid Detroit summer air she had known since childhood, thick and heavy, but also alive with the promise of storms that cleanse and renew. And she thought for a moment of her father's hands, calloused from decades in the auto plant, how he had held her small fingers in his and traced the lines of her palms as if reading a map of the future he had always believed was hers to shape. And she let that memory settle her shoulders, let it remind her that her place in this world had never been defined by the narrow vision of men who could not see beyond the color of her skin or the curve of her lips. And so, when Sterling finally found the words to speak, his voice was softer than before, less the confident bark of a man used to being obeyed, and more the hesitant murmur of someone who had just glimpsed the edges of his own ignorance. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, the syllables of her name sounding awkward in his mouth. "If what you say is true, if this engine is built on your stolen work—" He trailed off, the enormity of it settling in the hush, and Aaliyah met his gaze without flinching, her own voice clear and unwavering as she said, "It is not a matter of if, Mr. Sterling. It is a matter of fact." And she reached for the small, battered phone in her pocket, fingers scrolling through files until she found the blueprint she had carried with her like a talisman, the digital watermark of her initials, AM NASA 2019, etched into every line of code, every schematic, proof of her hand and her mind, woven into the very foundation of the RS-7000. And when she held it up for them all to see, the light from the screen caught the faint shimmer of sweat on her brow, a testament to the effort it took to stand here and lay bare the truth of who she was and what had been taken from her. And in that quiet reveal, the weight of 5 years of exile lifted from her shoulders, not erased, but acknowledged, and that was enough. Because she knew that while justice might be slow and flawed, there was power in simply being seen, in refusing to let others tell the story of her life for her, and in that power she found the calm to add, her voice measured and without malice. I did not come here to seek revenge or demand restitution. I came because this engine, if flown as it is, would fail catastrophically, and I could not allow that to happen, not when I carry the knowledge to prevent it. And as the words settled, she saw something shift in Sterling's eyes, a flicker of respect mingled with the heavy weight of his own complicity. And she knew then that she had given them a choice, to continue in their blindness or to see her, truly see her, not as an interloper or an anomaly, but as the engineer whose brilliance had once dreamed of carrying mankind to the stars. The hush that settled in the aftermath of Aaliyah's revelation was deeper than any silence that had come before, a stillness so complete it seemed to swallow the air itself, and for a long, suspended moment no one moved. The weight of her words, her quiet confession, and the proof she carried in the glow of her phone, holding them all in a kind of reverent pause. And Aaliyah, standing at the center of that quiet storm, felt the years of doubt and dismissal slide from her shoulders like an old, ill-fitting coat. And she drew a slow, steady breath as she turned her gaze outward, scanning the faces of the gathered engineers and executives, seeing in their eyes the crumbling of the illusions they had built around their own supremacy. And in that unraveling she saw something else too, something like possibility, the faint flicker of understanding that perhaps talent and brilliance were not bound by the pedigrees etched on diplomas or the exclusivity of Ivy League halls. And she let that small flicker of hope steady her as she spoke again, her voice low and even. "I do not expect you to undo the past," she said, each word deliberate, a gentle rebuke and an offering of clarity all at once. "But I will not stand by and let this machine, my machine in some way, become a weapon of your arrogance." And she saw the flush rise in Sterling's pale cheeks, saw the tremor in the hand he lifted to smooth back a strand of hair that had fallen from his carefully styled part. And she knew that beneath the veneer of his authority, he was grappling with the unfamiliar sensation of being held accountable by a woman he had not believed capable of challenging him, much less eclipsing him. And when he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost uncertain. "What would you have us do?" he asked. And there was something almost boyish in the question, a vulnerability she had not expected. And for a moment, Aaliyah saw the possibility of change there, fragile and flickering, and she chose to honor it, not for his sake, but for her own, because she had come too far and fought too hard to let bitterness be the only legacy she left in this room. And so, she straightened her shoulders and said, "You will fix the culture that allowed this theft to happen. You will stop measuring worth by pedigree and start measuring it by passion and precision." And the clarity of her words settled over the room like a balm. And though she knew it would not be easy, knew that change, real change, is a slow and often painful process, she also knew that she had planted a seed here today, one that might one day grow into something better than the world she had found herself exiled from. And in that quiet, unassuming hope, she found the strength to stand a little taller, her presence as undeniable as the machine she had just saved. The moment Aaliyah's words fell away, the silence that followed was no longer the brittle quiet of disbelief, but a deeper, almost contemplative hush, as if the room itself was pausing to absorb the weight of what she had just demanded of them. And she let that silence stand, let it breathe, because she understood that true change often begins in those uncomfortable spaces where the truth has been laid bare and there is nowhere left to hide. And as she watched Sterling's mouth work soundlessly for a moment, his carefully constructed mask of control finally showing the cracks beneath, she felt a flicker of something almost like pity, not because he deserved it, but because she recognized in him the echo of so many she had known. Men who had been taught from birth that their place in the world was assured, that their names and their connections were shields against accountability. And now, in the quiet that stretched between them, he was forced to reckon with a reality that had never needed his permission to exist. And it was in that reckoning that Aaliyah found the resolve to continue, her voice soft but unyielding. "This isn't about me reclaiming a title or demanding a place at your table," she said, her words carrying the quiet force of a tide that will not be turned. "It's about making sure that what I built isn't twisted into something that could kill people, and making sure that those who come after me, those who look like me, who dream like me, aren't shut out of this work simply because you can't see past your own assumptions." And in that moment, she saw a flash of understanding in the eyes of the young black girl in the back row, a spark that mirrored the one Aaliyah herself had carried since she was a child watching the rockets rise from Cape Canaveral, and she realized then that this was her victory, not in the applause that would never come, not in the grudging respect of men like Sterling, but in the quiet knowledge that she had stood her ground, and in doing so had lit a small, bright fire in a place where there had only been shadows before. And with that quiet triumph steady in her chest, she turned her gaze to the RS-7000, the engine that had been both her dream and her nightmare, and she felt the old ache of betrayal soften at the edges, replaced by a simple, enduring pride that no one could take from her. And she knew that whatever else might come, she had already done the most important thing of all. She had told the truth, and in that truth, she had reclaimed herself. The quiet weight of Aaliyah's final words seemed to settle over the room like a hush in the aftermath of a storm, the air charged and still, and she stood there at the center of it all, her shoulders squared and her chin lifted with the quiet dignity of someone who had weathered countless storms before and had learned how to bend without ever breaking. And in that stillness, she felt a calm settle over her, a kind of bone-deep certainty that she had done what she had come to do, not for the approval of the men who sat stunned in their designer suits, or for the headlines that would be written tomorrow, but for the girl she had once been, the girl who had dared to dream of reaching the stars even when the world told her she should be content to keep her feet planted firmly on the ground. And as she met the eyes of the young black girl in the back row once more, she saw in that gaze a spark of recognition, a promise that the path she had cleared would not be walked by her alone. And in that exchange, silent and fleeting though it was, she felt a flicker of something almost like joy, a quiet celebration of the knowledge that her fight had not been in vain. And it was that small, precious ember she carried with her as she turned back to Richard Sterling, who now seemed a smaller man than he had just hours ago, his shoulders hunched, as if the truth she had spoken was a weight he was only just beginning to understand. And when he finally found his voice, it was soft and rough-edged, the bravado stripped away. "What will you do now?" he asked, and the question hung there between them, heavy with all the things it didn't say. Would she stay and work for them? Would she demand her rightful place in the company she had so thoroughly unmasked? But Aaliyah simply tilted her head, a small, almost wistful smile tugging at the corner of her lips as she answered, "I will return to the place where dreams are born," she said softly, and though Sterling frowned, puzzled by the poetry of her words, she felt no need to explain further, because she knew that what mattered most was not the title she might have claimed or the salary she might have demanded, but the integrity she had reclaimed by standing here and telling the truth in a room that had once sought only her silence. And as she turned away from the engine, her engine, in some fundamental way that no theft or betrayal could ever erase, she felt a lightness in her step that had nothing to do with the polished stage or the cameras still recording every movement, and everything to do with the simple, powerful truth that she had chosen to speak, even when it would have been easier to walk away. As Aaliyah turned from the gleaming engine that still thrummed with the evidence of her mastery, a wave of emotion rose within her, fierce and bittersweet, and she felt the tightness in her throat as the memories she had carried for so long, heavy as iron, pressed to the surface. And in the quiet echo of her footsteps on the polished floor, she could almost hear the whispers of every doubt she had been forced to swallow every time her voice had been ignored in rooms filled with men who wore their privilege like armor and wielded it like a weapon. And the weight of those moments threatened to pull her back down into the shadows where she had learned to survive. But she would not let it, because in this moment, this singular, searing moment, she had laid them all to rest, and the realization brought with it a rush of warmth, a trembling at the edges of her composure that was equal parts grief for what had been stolen and pride for what she had reclaimed. And as she moved through the hush that had fallen over the room, the sea of faces now turned to watch her with a new, unspoken reverence. She felt the tremor in her right hand, where the scars still whispered of betrayal and of pain, but also of resilience, of the nights she had spent tracing those same lines in the dark, reminding herself that healing is not the same as forgetting, and that there is a quiet kind of power in carrying your history with you, no matter how much it once burned. And when she reached the edge of the stage, she paused for just a moment, her breath catching as her eyes found the girl in the back row again, her young, hopeful face a mirror of every dream Aaliyah had once been told she was foolish to hold. And in that fleeting connection, she felt the sting of tears she refused to let fall because she understood that this victory was not hers alone. It was a gift she had wrested back from the silence for every girl who would come after her. For every child who had been told that the stars were not meant for them, and as she stepped down from the stage, the cool metal of the railing biting into her palm, she held her head high, her shoulders square and unbowed, and though her heart thundered in her chest, it was not with fear, but with the quiet, steady rhythm of purpose. And she knew in the marrow of her bones that this was the ending of one story, but the beginning of another, and that was enough. That was everything. As Aaliyah stepped beyond the threshold of the conference hall, the cool air of the Detroit afternoon wrapped around her, a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere she left behind. Each footfall on the pavement echoed with a newfound clarity, the rhythm of her steps harmonizing with the steady beat of her heart, a heart that had weathered storms of betrayal, doubt, and silence, yet now pulsed with the quiet strength of reclaimed identity. The cityscape unfolded before her, familiar yet transformed, as if the very streets bore witness to her journey and now welcomed her return with open arms. She paused at a crosswalk, the hum of traffic and distant chatter forming a symphony of everyday life. In the reflection of a storefront window, she caught a glimpse of herself, not just the physical form, but the essence of a woman who had faced the abyss and emerged not unscathed but unbroken. The scars on her hand, once a source of pain and a reminder of loss, now symbolized resilience and the indomitable spirit that refused to be extinguished. Memories surged, nights spent in solitude, the weight of unjust accusations, the ache of dreams deferred. Yet, intertwined with the sorrow, was the unwavering support of the children at the library, their eyes alight with curiosity, their minds eager to explore the realms of science and possibility. They had seen her not as a disgraced engineer, but as a beacon of knowledge and inspiration. As she resumed her walk, the library's silhouette emerged in the distance, its familiar contours evoking a sense of home. Inside, she knew, awaited shelves of books, eager minds, and the comforting routine of shared discovery. But more than that, it represented a sanctuary where she could nurture the seeds of future innovators, ensuring that no child would ever feel their dreams were beyond reach due to their background or appearance. Crossing the threshold, she was greeted by the warm smiles of colleagues and the excited whispers of children. One young girl approached, eyes wide with admiration, clutching a drawing of a rocket ship. "Ms. Aaliyah," she said, "I want to build engines that take us to Mars, just like you." Emotion welled up, but Aaliyah managed a smile, kneeling to meet the girl's gaze. "And you will," she replied, "because the stars belong to all of us." In that moment, surrounded by the promise of a new generation, Aaliyah felt a profound sense of peace. Her journey had come full circle, not in the corridors of power or the acclaim of headlines, but in the quiet affirmation that her legacy would endure in the dreams she helped ignite. The gentle murmur of children's voices blended with the rustle of pages turning in the quiet library, and as Aaliyah moved between the rows of well-loved books, the scent of paper and ink filling her senses, she felt the steadying presence of each story that had ever been told, each dream that had ever been whispered into the darkness by those who believed in a world just beyond the horizon. And she let that quiet symphony wrap around her like a balm, soothing the echoes of doubt that still sometimes crept into the corners of her mind. And as she passed the small reading circle where a young boy was tracing his finger across the words in a picture book, she paused, her gaze softening as she watched him mouth the sounds of unfamiliar words, each syllable a small, triumphant step into the vastness of possibility. And she thought of her own first steps, of the weight of her father's hand on her shoulder as he told her she could be anything she dared to dream, and how those words had carried her across every chasm of uncertainty, every moment when the world seemed determined to tell her that her dreams were too big for a girl with skin as dark as the night sky. And she knelt beside the boy, her voice low and gentle as she said, "You know, every great engineer started right where you are, with a question and a book." And his eyes widened, a smile creeping across his face as he whispered, "Really?" And she nodded, her own smile tinged with the knowledge of how much those small moments can matter, how the seed of a dream can take root in the quietest of places and grow into something that changes the world. And as she rose to her feet again, her steps took her past the wide windows that overlooked the city beyond, the late afternoon sun painting the skyline in warm, golden light. And in that glow, she saw the reflection of her own silhouette, strong and steady, the woman she had fought so hard to become. And she let herself stand there for a moment, just breathing in the quiet promise of the day. And she knew with a calm certainty that she had found her place, not in the sterile white halls of those who had once dismissed her, but in the soft hush of the library, in the eager questions of children who saw in her not the scars of betrayal, but the spark of possibility. And in that knowing, she felt a peace that went deeper than any accolade, any apology she might have been offered because she had chosen her own path, had reclaimed her voice and her dignity and the truth of who she was. And that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The soft creak of the library's wooden floorboards under her feet felt like a quiet echo of all the paths she had walked to reach this moment, each step carrying with it the weight of battles fought and the gentle promise of new beginnings. And as Aaliyah paused by the small table near the back corner, she let her fingertips brush over the worn edges of the books stacked there, the titles a mosaic of curiosity and wonder. And she thought of how each page was a window into a world waiting to be discovered, just as every engine she had ever built was a testament to the worlds she had once dreamed of touching. And she let that thought settle in her chest like a warm glow, her breath deep and steady as she closed her eyes for a moment and listened to the gentle hum of life around her. The quiet laughter of children, the low murmur of a story being read aloud by an elderly volunteer, and the distant murmur of traffic beyond the windows. And she realized that this small haven of knowledge and imagination was every bit as vital, as alive, as any high-tech laboratory or corporate boardroom, because it was here that the next generation of dreamers and doers would find the courage to lift their eyes to the stars and believe that those distant points of light were meant for them too. And as she turned away from the table, she saw a young boy with skin the color of deep mahogany and a bright, eager smile clutching a book about flight, his fingers tracing the diagrams of wings and engines with a reverence that made her heart ache in the best possible way. And when he looked up and met her gaze, his expression a mix of curiosity and quiet determination, she felt the memory of her own childhood spark to life in her chest. The memory of a girl who had once stood in a library just like this one, eyes wide with wonder, and had whispered to herself that one day she would build something that soared, and she knelt beside him, her voice low and kind as she said, "You see those engines? They're powerful, but what really makes them fly is the dream behind them." And the boy's eyes widened, a shy smile tugging at his lips as he whispered, "I want to build engines too." And she smiled back, the quiet strength of her own journey echoing in the warmth of that moment, because she knew then that her story was not just hers alone, that every triumph and every heartbreak had led her here, to this small, bright spark of possibility that would grow and burn and light the way for all those who came after her. Aaliyah rose slowly from where she had crouched beside the boy, her knees creaking in protest, but her spirit light, and as she straightened, she caught sight of the reflection in the window again, her own figure, tall and unbowed, framed by the soft afternoon light that painted the city's worn brick and steel in shades of gold. And in that fleeting glimpse, she saw not just the woman she had become, but the girl she had once been, the girl who had dared to dream beyond the limits of what she had been told was possible. And she felt a quiet surge of pride at how far she had come, not because she had proven herself to those who once dismissed her, but because she had stayed true to the spark that had always burned in her chest, the fierce, unwavering belief that her mind was capable of wonders, no matter what the world around her tried to say. And as she turned away from the window, the weight of that history settled into her bones in a way that was both grounding and freeing. And she let it be. Let it exist alongside the gentle joy she felt now, because she understood that healing was not about erasing the past, but about carrying it with dignity. Each scar a testament to survival, and each triumph a quiet promise to those who would come after. And she let that promise guide her steps as she moved through the library, her fingers trailing lightly over the spines of books that had been her refuge and her inspiration for as long as she could remember. And she paused for a moment by the circulation desk, where an elderly librarian with kind eyes looked up and offered her a small, knowing smile, as if to say, "I see you, and I am proud of you." And Aaliyah felt that smile settle in her chest like a benediction, a soft confirmation that she was exactly where she needed to be. And as she moved toward the small reading room in the back, a quiet space where children sprawled on beanbags and let their imaginations take flight, she let herself breathe deeply, let herself feel the fullness of this moment, because she knew that this gentle, vibrant haven of learning and wonder was more than enough, and in its quiet embrace, she felt the last pieces of her fractured past knit together into something whole and strong, something that would carry her forward with grace and with purpose. As the last rays of the afternoon sun slipped through the library's tall windows, casting warm streaks of light across the worn wooden floors, Aaliyah found herself standing in the doorway of the small reading room, her heart quiet but resolute, and for a long moment she let the gentle murmur of children's voices wash over her, the soft rustle of pages turning like a comforting echo of every night she had spent with a book in her hands and her mind alive with dreams of flight and freedom. And in that stillness, she felt the gentle weight of every choice she had made, every time she had chosen to rise instead of retreat, to speak instead of swallow her truth. And she let herself be proud, not just of the woman she had become, but of the girl who had first dared to believe that the stars were hers to reach for. And as she stepped further into the room, a small girl with bright, curious eyes looked up from the stack of books at her feet and smiled shyly. And in that smile, Aaliyah saw the echo of her own wonder, her own defiance, and she knew in that instant that this was her legacy. Not the patents stolen from her or the accolades denied, but the quiet, steadfast conviction that brilliance is not measured by titles or trophies, but by the courage to keep building in the face of those who would tear you down. And she knelt beside the girl, her voice soft and sure as she said, "You know, the most powerful engines are born in the quiet corners of the world, in the hearts of those who refuse to be told no." And the girl's eyes widened, a spark of determination flaring in their depths, and Aaliyah felt the last remnants of bitterness in her chest dissolve into something softer, something almost like hope, because she understood now that every battle she had fought had not been for the approval of those who would never see her fully, but for the right of every child who came after her to know that their dreams were worth fighting for. And as she rose and turned to leave the room, she felt the soft weight of that promise settle across her shoulders like a cloak, and she carried it with her as she stepped back into the bright light of the late afternoon, the air cool and sweet against her skin, and in that light she walked forward, her head high and her heart steady, knowing that the quiet power she carried within her was not just hers alone, but a gift she would share with every soul who dared to believe in the impossible. Aaliyah's journey reminds us that true brilliance is not measured by accolades or credentials, but by the unwavering resolve to stand in our own truth, even when the world refuses to see it. In her quiet defiance and in the gentle strength of her final choice, we find a reflection of our own battles, those moments when we are called not to prove our worth to others, but to honor it within ourselves. As we leave her story behind, let it inspire us to carry that same quiet courage forward, to speak when silence is demanded, to build when others would tear us down, and to remember that our dreams are never too small for the vastness of the stars above us. If this story has touched you, share your thoughts in the comments, like and subscribe for more stories that celebrate the quiet revolutions we each hold in our hearts, and above all, believe in the power of your own voice.